Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 34 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 7-4. And this was a bit of a strange game from San Jose, because if you just look at the scoreboard here tonight, you're probably thinking, the Sharks were terrible defensively, the goaltending was shaky, and the Sharks' offense just could not keep up with the amount of goals that they were giving up. And this is, of course, partially true. The Sharks defensively were very, very far from perfect and had some pretty glaring issues on the night, the first of which would be the amount of continuously sloppy turnovers that they have in their own defensive zone. This has been a major issue over the last few games for San Jose, but players are just not being able to make the clean first pass, and I'm not expecting some sort of crazy breakout pass that starts a 3-on-2 rush the other way, but just simply getting the puck out of the zone has been a major problem for a lot of defensemen from the San Jose Sharks over these past couple of weeks, which has led to a lot of these losses recently. On top of that, an issue that has been here for pretty much the entirety of the season thus far is that the Sharks' defense give just too much respect to oncoming rushing forwards, and as such they back off from the blue line, giving so much time and space to make a skilled play happen. We saw that happen multiple times here tonight, which led to a couple of Canucks goals. And then on top of that, we also have just some lax play in front of the net by the San Jose Sharks, just not tying up sticks, not clearing out the front, making the life of their goaltender extremely difficult when it comes to having to make saves off of like triple deflected pucks in front off of a simple point shot. So these are obvious defensive issues and is a big reason for why the Sharks ended up giving up 6 goals on a manned net, 7 if you include the empty net goal. But apart from that, oddly enough, if you can put that to the side, defensively in their own zone, the Sharks didn't do all that bad a job. The Canucks are an extremely effective offensive team. They are the best team in the league currently, at least if you go by the standings, and they do so not because of some suffocating defensive game like we saw from the Los Angeles Kings a few days ago, but instead because this team has a ton of offensive talent on it. And the Sharks, when it came to actually defending against that offensive talent when they would set up in the zone, was actually pretty good. The Sharks were blocking a ton of shots, up at 22 block shots on the night, but also were getting sticks in passing lanes, not allowing the Canucks to get those cross-ice passes, which players like Pettersson, Besser, and JT Miller absolutely thrive on receiving. When they're working it around the offensive zone for a minute, 90 seconds at a time, they can tire out those defensive players, which allows for those openings, and the Sharks did a good job at preventing that from happening. Just because of the previous issues that I mentioned, the Sharks end up giving up way too many goals in this game anyhow, and so they do end up losing. But when you consider the fact that the Sharks managed to score 4 goals and even had a couple of other chances that came very close to going in as well, considering the 2 other losses this week, or the 2 other games this week were losses against the Coyotes and the Los Angeles Kings, it's maybe a bit weird to say, but this was likely the Sharks' best game of the week, which I guess, although you were probably hoping for a win, that is a decent note to end on heading into the small holiday break over these next few days. This is obviously not going to end up being a game still that David Quinn heads into the locker room and says, oh, all right, we tried and that was a good effort. He's probably still going to be upset, but it wasn't necessarily all that bad a game against the NHL's best team in the league, especially considering the performance the Sharks had against one of the other best teams in the league, the Los Angeles Kings, just a few days ago. Moving quickly through what happened in this game, the Canucks started off exceptionally well with the 2 first goals of this one within just the first few minutes of the first period, and it gave a bit of PTSD that we might end up in a similar situation for a game earlier on in November where the Sharks played against the Canucks and gave up 10 goals against in that game. But the Sharks pretty quickly responded. They shut down what the Canucks could do. In fact, they prevented the Canucks from getting a shot on goal in the latter half of the first period, and they not only cut the lead in half but even tied the game with goals from Granlund and Hurdle to as such head into the second period with a tied at 2 game. In the second, however, is where the Sharks would definitely fall apart, not generating any chances, not really generating any zone time, and instead it was the Canucks who were making use of those deficiencies in the Sharks' defensive game and got 3 goals for themselves. Zetterlund would add one in to make it a slightly more respectable period, but instead it would still be a 2-goal lead for the Canucks heading into the third, 5-3. However, we have learned over these past few weeks that you cannot count out the San Jose Sharks, and while it did take a few minutes into the third, 13 to be exact, it is Jacob McDonald who gets the goal that brings this to within 1. And it looked like the San Jose Sharks, they might be able to have that crazy comeback magic once again in their sleeve here tonight, but unfortunately, the comeback would be stopped in its tracks as the Canucks would get the next goal to make it 6-4 and regain their 2-goal lead, and while the Sharks would end up pulling the goaltender, it would be very hard to watch with multiple misplays from players like Hurdle, from players like Eklund. In fact, Eklund primarily was giving the puck away multiple times in those last couple of minutes with the goaltender pulled, and it would eventually be Quinn Hughes getting the empty netter to put the Sharks away 7-4. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Eklund, Hurdle, and Zadina, and I just mentioned that Eklund was having those issues 6-on-5 here tonight with giving the puck away, but other than that, I thought Eklund actually had a pretty successful game. No points here tonight, but he was on the ice for, I believe, 3 of these goals, 4 if I'm not mistaken, and was a pretty big part of a couple of them for sure. This was maybe not, I would say probably the best line for the San Jose Sharks. In fact, their top 2 lines were relatively solid, at least from an offensive standpoint, and I thought Eklund did a pretty good job here tonight, but he was not the best player on the line. In fact, I would say that was likely Tomas Hurdle. Hurdle had a very, very rough start to this game. Just in the first couple of minutes, he had some couple of really bad giveaways, and you could tell how frustrated he was with himself because of that, as after one giveaway in particular in the offensive zone that got it going the other way for the Canucks, he ends up slamming his stick into the boards, showing off that anger in how he had started that game so poorly. But perhaps because of that emotion being let out, he ends up completely turning it around with a 180 performance and ends up likely being the Sharks' best forward on the night, sets up many great chances, solid offensive zone presence, scores a goal, which ended up being that game-tying goal late in the first period, and so it was a nice look for Hurdle for sure. And then when it comes to the final player on this line, it is Filip Zadina once again giving an opportunity after a strong performance in the previous one against the Arizona Coyotes, and again, he looks quite good. 2 assists here tonight, which I believe is more points than he's ever put up in a game thus far this season with the San Jose Sharks, perhaps tying if I'm remembering incorrectly. But it was an effective first line, and I thought all 3 of these players were pulling their weights in the same direction. Was it an outstanding game for them? Perhaps not, but competitive for sure. When it comes to the second line, we again have Zetterlund, Granlund, and Duclair. And this was a line that generated a lot of chances. Duclair, we saw, had a couple of really close calls here tonight. And of course, he also took the shot that led to the Granlund goal as he deflected that one into the net. A very strong veteran play by Granlund to sort of interfere, quote unquote, but not get the penalty call with the Canucks defenseman to clear that lane and then also be able to deflect it into the net. Perhaps maybe a bit luck-based, but still, this was a line that was generating great chances, and I thought the player who really stood out the most on this line was likely Fabian Zetterlund, as he not only gets a goal, he had one that was also exceptionally close as well, and he was just doing a very good job at finding the soft spots on the ice, finding those holes in the Canucks defense where he could put himself into strong scoring positions. It kind of reminded me a lot of Luke Cunnin back in the earlier parts of this season, except Granlund was actually getting good shots off and actually scoring goals in this game. And so while this wasn't necessarily as effective of a forechecking line as it was for the top line in tonight's game, as is usually the case, they were still generating a good share of chances for the Sharks. However, once we leave the top 6 for San Jose, we get to the bottom 6 where things were not nearly as positive. The only saving grace from the third line these past couple of games has been Mike Hoffman, as both Luke Cunnin and Justin Bailey have struggled as of late. That upside no longer exists here tonight. Hoffman was not particularly good, and his line mates did not bail him out in that regard. Neither Bailey nor Cunnin made really any sort of positive impact on this game. Cunnin in particular has just been mostly invisible over these past few games, and that is leading to this third line just doing literally nothing positive for the San Jose Sharks. They are not pushing the pace. They are not getting offensive zone time. They're not working together. There's just nothing good coming from these 3 players over this last week. And then when we get to the fourth line, we have Labanc, Studnicka, and Jacob McDonald back in the forward position in favor of the injured Giovanni Smith. And I already talked about in my last review that the Jack Studnicka experiment had kind of failed, or at least up to that point. Here in Game 4, there is no change on that front. The only noticeable thing that Studnicka did in this game was take a penalty, which is obviously not a good thing. He's just doing literally zero for San Jose. It's just not a particularly effective trade that Micah Greer has made. I'll give him the kudos for going for it, to trying to get a player who might be useful for the team, but it feels as though it's just a sixth round pick that has essentially been tossed into the bonfire at this point, because this player is deserves at this point seemingly to be in the AHL, or at least not in the starting 12 for San Jose. And then when it comes to the two other players on this line, Kevin Labanc, perhaps because of Studnicka, perhaps because of his own game, he was just also quite invisible here tonight, which is not going to do good things for his reputation with David Quinn. As we know, there is a bit of a rough patch in their relationship, so to speak, and Labanc having these past couple of games not be effective at all is not really going to help out in that regard. When it comes to Jacob McDonald, he also wasn't really doing much in this game, but he does score, which you do have to give credit for, and I liked the interesting adaptation that David Quinn made in this situation, because McDonald does not score from a forward standpoint here tonight, instead from a defensive standpoint, as Quinn sends over the top line of Eklund, Zadina, and Hertl, and then has McDonald playing as a defenseman for just that particular shift, because it was an offensive zone faceoff. And so it was definitely a pretty cool coaching move, and it ended up panning out. More that offensive instinct from Jacob McDonald to come down from the point in that particular situation allows him to get that goal. So definitely not an outstanding game from a forward perspective, great zone time or anything, perhaps because his line mates weren't particularly good, but he does put up a goal. You got to give credit for that. When it comes from a defensive standpoint, we have both Burrows and Mario Ferraro. Now, the major thing to point out with Ferraro, something that I brought up in the previous review of the Coyotes game, was that Ferraro has seemingly been going much more so from an offensive perspective thus far this season, primarily last game, and also definitely here tonight, as he puts up not one, not two, but 3 assists, and it feels as though it's been a long time that a defenseman not named Erik Karlsson or Brent Burns has actually put up 3 points in any particular game for the San Jose Sharks, and yet Ferraro did so, and he's just been continuing to try and make these very aggressive plays offensively. But from the other side of the coin in that situation, you also see why that can be quite dangerous, as Ferraro was caught on the ice multiple times with insanely long shifts, which causes it to be a much more difficult time defending in his own zone. I think there was 3 or 4 times where he ended up with over 2-minute shifts, because he was not only going for those offensive plays, but then when things ended up turning around and going the other way, he was caught on the ice and having to defend. So it's a bit of a give and take here for Ferraro. He needs to be able to find that right balance, but you can't really talk all that badly about him after a 3-assist night. When it comes to the second pairing, we had Vlasic jump back into the lineup, since of course McDonald, who played defenseman last game, moved to forward. They needed to fill in this gap, and Vlasic is the choice in that particular area. Vlasic, did he have a good game? No. Is that a surprise? Also no, and so there isn't really much else to be said. When it comes to Henry Thrun, I actually thought Thrun, who was already looking a bit better in the previous one against the Coyotes, continued to see some notable improvement here tonight. Again, not anything outstanding, not anything like we had seen from him in his short stint last season with the San Jose Sharks, but compared to the first couple of games since his recall, which were actively awful for him, it definitely has been some better things, some better performances, and he has definitely settled in a bit. And then when it comes to the final pairing here for the San Jose Sharks, Ruda and Ahotyuk reunited after they had some decent enough chemistry before Ruda had to step out of the lineup due to illness. When it comes to Ahotyuk, like I said in my previous one, the sort of evaluation of him continues to be the same. There continues to be the same issues. I'll be the first one to congratulate him when he actually puts up a good performance that I feel is worthy of sort of planning a parade here, because it would be his first solid performance in a while, but that has yet to happen. And so there's no reason to continue to dwell on him at this point, because just nothing has changed. I mean, there was just this one horrible giveaway literally right in front of his own net to a Canucks player. You just can't at any level let that happen, and it's just been a consistent thing for a Hatyuk, so not really much else to say. When it comes to Ruda, I thought Ruda actually looked half decent, not exactly making a huge impact on the game, but as that is kind of Ruda's MO thus far this season, he's either been kind of bad or honestly relatively average, and that's sort of where he landed here tonight. And then when it finally comes to the goaltender, we have Mackenzie Blackwood. A bit of surprise that he gets the start. I thought it would be Kaapo Kähkönen heading into the break, especially after Blackwood's somewhat shaky performance against the Coyotes. And here tonight we are treated to yet another kind of shaky performance from Blackwood. A couple of these goals were absolutely savable from him, especially the first Kuzmenko goal that got the Canucks started here tonight. That's one that you definitely want to see your goaltender be able to make, and it just didn't end up happening. And so while there are definite issues with the Sharks defensively when defending against the rush from the Canucks, I also thought a couple of these goals at least could have been saved by Blackwood and just really weren't. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks, of course, will be back in action on Wednesday after the mandated 3-day holiday break. They are currently on a losing streak, which they obviously didn't want to head into these more festive times with, but perhaps they'll be able to break out of that by the time we do return. Class dismissed.